So I was recently speaking with a professional basketball coach that I've had the privilege of supporting over the years. They had just won the national championship in their country. And I asked him what was one of the biggest keys to success for his team this season. And it's something that the news media hasn't and won't highlight. And he straight away, without hesitation, said, our after action review process. This is something I talk about in the book, The Culture System, in the kind of, especially in the bonus chapters PDF, which you can get from the website, myculturesystem.com. And it's also extensively talked about and developed in our transformational coaching and culture certification course. But their team would take time to review, sometimes as a whole team, sometimes in small groups, and sometimes just in pairs. But they did this AAR every single game, and they use their values to reflect on the behaviors. Now, many times he said it was repetitive and it wasn't always exciting, but they were intentional and they were committed. So often rituals and routines like these, like coaches will often start them, but they stop them toward the season because they're not fun or they can feel stale. But you know what? Brushing your teeth or taking a shower, these aren't things that most of us get excited about, but they're really important. AARs, after action reviews, they're like taking a shower after a game. Not very exciting, but quite important. So I'm excited today for the second part of our conversation with former Navy SEAL Jon Cleck, because he's going to unpack what makes the Navy SEAL leadership and team so unique. And one of the foundational practices that he decided to talk about on those teams was the after action review. So coaches, lock in. You are in for a good one today. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nurbin, and I'm joined again by my co-host and friend, Nate Sanderson. Betsy Butterick sat this interview out. If you'd like to learn more about TOC and our work to support coaches, you can head on over to tocculture.com. We've got online courses. We've got free articles, free PDFs. You can check out our books there, as well as learn more about our one-to-one coaching program. And you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter so you can get the notes to this and every episode of the podcast.
Well, one of the things you talk a lot about here, obviously, just in our conversation here, is this relationship with stress and the relationship, whether that's environmental or that's, what we're feeling and what we're enduring internally. In your work with leaders, it seems like there's a mindset shift that happens through your training that prepares you, obviously, for the roles and duties of a SEAL down the road. I'm sure you've taken lessons away from that and speak on stress for leaders, because obviously whether you're coaching or you're in the business world, we're dealing with all kinds of variables that cause stress when we expect it and sometimes when we don't. So how do you start to coach people and coach leaders to maybe recalibrate kind of their relationship and their approach to stress?
I have a special relationship with stress. It's not only something that I've studied in my doctoral program, and has been at the forefront of something that I've studied. But it's also something I've experienced and something I've had to manage through, and something I've been fortunate to help organizational leaders. I do some speaking, and I do some leadership workshops to help leaders. And the focus of much of what I do is focused on stress. And stress is most often a product, not always, but most often a product of fear. And so, and I always caveat that by saying, when I talk about fear, people go, "Oh, Navy SEAL fear. Okay, you're like jumping out of a plane or being shot." You go, no. Fear is stress and anxiety exacerbated by fear. Is that's something we can all relate to, and it's not the Navy SEAL, fear of getting shot or fear of whatever sharks or something like that people often say, you're Navy SEAL level fear. That's a different thing. No, it's fear of failure. It's fear of the unknown. The unknown is often, that's why there's an entire science dedicated to change management for organizations. And that's why there's consultants that do change management specifically. Shout out to Greencastle. But they are, but it's because people resist fear because they're fearful of, they resist change because they are fearful of change. Largely, the precursor behind stress is something that I focus on with organizational leaders. And it's something that I've just been, so blessed to be able to experience, to study, and now to help other people overcome.
When you think about performance as a Navy SEAL and dealing with the stress of that environment, I feel like there are certain things that you, and even kind of how it relates to athletics and sports, there's a level of preparation you can do, I think, to actually minimize the amount of stress that you feel. But I've also been really always amazed at like some of the research that like people like Dr. Kelly McGonigal have done around like just the fact that you embrace it. You know this is going to be stressful. How much, when you think about you as a Navy SEAL and how they prepare you for combat, are they preparing you to just not get stressed out, or is it a bit of both of, hey, we're also preparing you like this is going to be stressful. You got to learn to embrace it and rise to the challenge.
It's a little bit of both. You learn to embrace, and there's a saying we have called "embrace the suck," and it's more than just the teams. The military writ large has largely adopted that in a lot of environments. But it is embracing that opportunity to be uncomfortable, getting comfortable being uncomfortable. So that is a way that you inoculate yourself to stress, and there's a lot of science, and I'm one of the guys that's researching some of that science on how to inoculate yourself to stress. I spent 12 years as a federal law enforcement officer. In that time, I was an instructor and an instructor trainer for active shooter instructors, and I really became keenly aware of stress and how stress limits performance in that environment. Because even these highly trained cops and federal agents and street cops, when put in an active shooter situation, that's where you really saw that stress manifest itself in ways that a street cop normally wouldn't experience. And so what I learned by observing that and creating very stressful environments was that the stress, the opportunities to endure very high levels of stress. One, there's a couple things that happens with it is you start to, your brain, what happens, and I don't mean to geek out on the science too deep of what happens when you're dealing with stress, but your brain digs into the recesses of its mind. When your brain experiences, we're talking acute stress, stuff that triggers the fight, flight, or freeze, which doesn't have to be something like an active shooter event. It could be going on stage to deliver a speech at some convention. But the brain processes stress the same way. Essentially, the brain goes back and looks in the recesses of its memories and says, I believe it's the amygdala. It goes back and says, have I been here before? And if the answer is no, then your brain goes, like your stress level spikes. Now your brain's like, oh man, I haven't been here. What if I fail? Like, how am I going to go through this? That's where you talk about, people that go before they go out to speech, they go like, I can't remember the first word I'm going to say. I'm so high, my stress level is high. Or if you're in youth sports and this is your coach says you're the starting quarterback, your first time starting because the other quarterback got injured, your first time going out there, and you look to the left and you look at the right and you see that defensive line trying to get you, and your stress level is going to be high. So how do we mitigate that? And that's really what I've focused a lot of my studies on, is how do we mitigate that? And the way we mitigate it is by, it's almost taking the phobia level of, or the traditional phobia treatment. If you have a fear of snakes, they don't let you handle a snake. They show you a picture of a snake. Then you go to the zoo and you look at the snake behind glass, and then they put you in a room and you're like 9 feet away from a somebody else handling a snake. And then you gradually inoculate yourself to that stress. And what happens is, in our brains is you don't have to have been, the coach says you're going in as a starting quarterback. You don't have to have been on the field and against that very team running that exact same play. What you had to have experienced is on the practice field, being on that field and having the opposing team try and come and get you, right? And I'm speaking of American football, but it's the brain goes, have I been here before? And if the answer is no, but I've been somewhere similar, That's how you inoculate your brain to the stress of a similar situation. For coaches, and for what I do with organizational leaders, is try and get them exposed to levels of stress where your brain goes, hey, have I been here before? No. But have I been in even a similar circumstance? A little bit. And I've come out of this and I've been in a high level of stress 100 times. And that's what BUDS and then ultimately the SEAL teams teaches you to do is you may never have been in that firefight in that mountain in Afghanistan, but you've been at very, very high levels of stress and you've been able to work through it. And when your stress level comes down, your performance goes up. And there's a whole like a seesaw. The more they can inoculate themselves to their body and their brains and their emotions, experiencing higher levels of stress, the more they can inoculate themselves to that, the lower their stress response is going to be in any other situation in life, and the more the greater they're going to perform in any kind of situation. Whether their boss says, "Hey, I want you to go close this sales deal," or they have to deal with a bully in school, their stress level is going to come down. They're going to perform better.
One of the things that I think, was so admirable and what we look at, like the Navy SEALs, and I think why people really do like to study them is because of that mental side, being able to operate effectively as a team, especially as things come up. I've read a lot about that. Of, Navy SEALs, yeah, you have a plan, a mission, a goal, but you're able to get into combat or really sticky situations that you weren't necessarily expecting, but be able to work through that effectively as a group. You mentioned earlier.
Let me weigh in on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to weigh in on that. There's one great example that I think reinforces that. In the SEALs have done a lot of great missions in the 60 years we've been around, and but the most high profile one of them, the capture of bin Laden or the assault on the bin Laden compound, the most high stress op that we've ever done as a community. And I wasn't on the op, but just talking to guys that were on it, like they thought they were going to get suicide bombed. Like they thought so now you exacerbate the stress because they think this is the end, right? They think this is the last mission they'll ever go on. But even then, you're in a foreign country, you need everything to go right to lower your stress response. On the way in, they have a plan. Before they even set foot down on the target, the helicopter crashes. And for those who don't know the whole story, right, that helicopter crashing, that sent the plan, like it's like the Mike Tyson thing. Everybody's got that plan till the first punch is thrown. That was the first punch they were thrown. And now everything else went to shit because they didn't have a force that was going to helicopter or fast rope onto the top of the building. And to the credit of the guys that were on that mission, they just rolled with it. They were like, okay, plan B. I don't know if we've absolutely, scripted out this plan B, but we've conditioned ourselves to deal with this level of stress and to just think through it. So, all right, let's just roll with the punches and let's figure out how we're going to make this work. And that is, to me, is one of the quintessential examples of not just the SEAL teams, but the military and or anybody who works through it, dealing with when your plan goes sideways. If you've conditioned yourself to, and it wasn't like they had a contingency plan for everything. When that went sideways, yes, they had contingency plans, but when that went sideways, they rolled through it. The leadership on their communications were like, okay, this is what happened. Let's go. We're rolling with it. Let's go. And we're just gonna continue to achieve the mission without worrying about, but I don't have this perfect plan anymore. And that is really a great example of the ways that not only the SEAL teams, but just organizations have been able to do that.
I think that was great. I think it's really kind of where I want to kind of head towards as we kind of start to wrap things up, but is really important. And I think especially in some sports like basketball or American football, we see a lot of like the coaches trying to control every element of it and put together the perfect plan, right? I hear coaches all the time, just like, even thinking, if I'd only done more scouting, if I only done more preparation, we could have, what I'm hearing you share is, well, maybe it's not necessarily about always having this plan for everything, but it's also about equipping our athletes with the ability to communicate and work effectively as a team through challenging circumstances, and I think in other sports, like say rugby, where I'm at in Ireland here, like they go on the field and like coaches aren't doing a whole lot, right? Like you're just kind of sitting back for the most part. Like there's not a lot of, this joystick operating. And so I think this ties into what you shared earlier on the leadership style of a Navy SEAL, which is it's a little less of the command and control type of just, you kind of mentioned that earlier. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on leadership. What is effective leadership in the SEALs? Where do people get it wrong in the SEALs, or where do people really, from your perspective, get it wrong? Maybe what you see in sports or in organizations.
Oh, that's a deep question too. And you're right. There's a lot of great examples. There are good examples outside the SEAL teams. I've heard. I'm a big fan of American football, but that's not the only sport that I'm a fan of. I'm a big fan of just sports in general, and I watch a lot. I've heard American football described as a chess match between the two coaches, and I think that's an accurate reflection of what American football is, and that is why it is so tightly controlled with the play callers on the side and the chess pieces on the field. And I'm not taking away from the Tom Brady's of the world and the really good guys who can start to, if he's the queen on that chessboard, he has the ability to say, I'm not moving left, I'm moving right. And so he has the ability to override the play call. And there's really good players out there who, once they've been in the game for a minute, they can start to influence those decisions. But I've heard American football described that way. My kids are new to rugby, and we just started playing literally just 5 weeks ago. So I'm very new to it, but I'm really, even at they're 13 and 11, the boys are, I am really taken by how much, having been a football guy, how much autonomy the players have on the field to make those decisions. And I think that's certainly much more aligned with how the SEALs operate that doesn't make anything wrong about American football. It's just a different thing. And I think American football is probably more akin to maybe how the Marines work. And the Marines, again, that's not to denigrate or take away anything. They're phenomenal. I've worked with them my whole career, and they're awesome individuals. They just work differently, and it's not better or worse, just differently. But they also have a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-old kids that are new to the service that comprise of a great bulk of their worker force, right? Of their workforce. So those are young men and young women who need a little bit more guidance, who need a little bit more of that American football approach to manage how they do it. The SEAL teams, the average age coming out of BUDS, I believe, is 24 or 25. So we're dealing with a more mature and a more seasoned individual just to begin with. And that leadership, if you watch the Lone Survivor movie, when Danny and Murph and Axe are up though on the mountain with up on the mountain with Luttrell, Murph says, he's the lieutenant. So again, we talked about sort of how the SEAL teams operate. He's the lieutenant, but he solicits information from and his input from his team. At the end of the day, he makes a decision, and that decision goes against what some members of his team have said. So we respect that level. It goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. We respect that level of authority, but the levels of authority, the positional leaders also respect that we have insights, input, and that we have a valuable lens and a valuable perspective. So how does that come back to leaders and leadership? There are times and there are circumstances, and I've done consulting with everything from factories and logistics warehouses who they need a little bit. They have a very transient workforce, and it's so that requires a little bit more of an intense, and it might be just a nice way of saying micromanagement, but with the goal always being to empower your workforce. Now, if you have a transient workforce, it's a little harder to do because it's all you have some cycles, turnover. But for organizational leaders, and that includes coaches in other environments, the goal is to empower your people to make those decisions, and to make decisions that might not be the exact decision that you would make, but they have been conditioned to use a logical and articulate thought process to come to that decision. I worked for one of the greatest guys I've ever worked for, a guy named Joe Crandall, who worked for the consulting firm that I worked for a couple of years. One of his greatest attributes, I mean, he was just a great leader for a variety of reasons, but he bought this consulting firm when it was very small, and he had a goal of making it a much larger consulting firm. But he recognized that he couldn't do that as a CEO. So he empowered his people and he gave them great latitude to make mistakes. Now, not if you made the same mistake twice, now that's a problem. Or if you made a mistake that cost the company money or time or energy, that was okay if you could articulate why your thought process allowed you or led you down that hole, and at what point you said, hey, let's cut our ties here. Let's go back and circle back and start over. We cost the company time and money and energy a lot, but he always gave us the latitude to be able to experiment, because innovation doesn't come without experimentation, right? And experimentation doesn't come without failure. So you have to be able to give your people the bandwidth to be able to, if you want them to be innovative and you want them to be leaders, to be leaders, you have to have an innovative culture. To be innovative, you have to be experimental. To be experimental, I mean, it's built into the word. To experiment means to fail sometimes. So how do you empower your people doing that? Giving them the ability and holding them accountable, giving them the ability to be able to fail and then learn from that, and then and make the course corrections so that it doesn't happen again, and so that your thought process that led you to that failure, that you've also learned from that and said, hey, maybe I entrusted Mike to do this, when in fact that's not really in his wheelhouse. That's not his skill set. And that can translate from the organizational, from the boardroom to the playing field as well.
And just to follow up on that really quickly, I know that, there's procedure for that in your SEAL training right after missions and the AARs, where there is this back and forth of communication. Decisions were made. What did it look like from the top down? What did it look like from the bottom up, in order to be able to make better decisions in the future, right? And I think that's a great template for coaches as well. We try to lean into as much player input as we can, but also try to find ways to communicate how we got to the strategy or the decisions that we did. Ultimately, when we're coming out of that film session or looking back at that game, that the players also, learn from our perspective and our way of thinking, and we learn from them.
Just want to kind of finish up here with one question that I think somewhat actually ties to what you just shared there, because what I think is really impactful is that you're talking about allowing people to make decisions, not just in a high stress environment, where the cost is really high, right? It's losing your life. And I hear coaches all the time in sports say, yeah, my big thing is like, I'll let them, assistant coach, or I'll let the players make a decision. But when it comes down to the winning or losing the game, like, it's my ass is on the line. Like, I'll be the one that's fired, right? The cost is high, but it's not life or death here, right? And
you can coach when we're up by 40 points.
Yeah, exactly, right? But you guys are willing to let each other make decisions and give up that in really high cost environments. I just find that to be really, really fascinating. The thing I have a question for you here is somewhat connected to this idea of, like, the cost is really, really high in war, and there are deaths and there is brutal things that happen. And yet you now, interestingly enough, have this kind of a career pivot of moving into comedy and being a comedian. I'm curious, we talked a little bit earlier, and some of that I'll share here later on, but I'm curious, this idea around humor for you, where did that start to manifest when you were a Navy SEAL, and how did you kind of use humor to maybe bring was it to bring the team together? Was it to help relieve stress? Like, what is so important about humor and laughter when it comes to teams, performance, dealing with stress in the highest, most stressful environments people could be in?
There's a couple things, and I'll just focus on two. The first is that different people have different outlets for relieving stress, and like all of us, we were all dealt, a hand as a kid. And whether, it's not everybody's born as silver spoon. Even people who are born silver spoons have, some level of stress. And comedy or humor was just a way that in our family that we just found a great outlet for. My dad died suddenly when I was 9 years old, and just using humor. We were a humorous family anyway, but just it was my mom and my two brothers and I after that, and we just found humor was just always an outlet for us to deal with pain and stress. And so I wouldn't say I was a student of it, a student of the science of comedy as much as just be kind of a practitioner and a recipient of humor and the great benefits that it has to our mental health, to our emotional health. So that was the first thing, was just as a stress reliever. In the SEAL teams, you're dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of high tension, and it's a great outlet. And there's so many funny things that just happen and that you can't help but laugh if you take a very unique approach to looking at what you consider funny. The second part of why I do not just enjoy humor, but why I started doing stand-up, it comes back to everything we've talked about up to this point. I love stand-up and I love watching it. And I thought, you're kind of a funny guy. People go, you should try stand-up. And I never did it. From the time I was a teenager, I always wanted to do it, but it terrified me. And I did not do stand-up for 20 years. I did the first time I went on stage, I was 40 years old. And the reason I went on stage is because I got tired of me capitulating to the fear of going on stage. I had jumped out of planes. I had operated dove under aircraft carriers, and I'd experienced all kinds of stress around the world, but I would not go on stage to do stand-up. And it bothered the hell out of me that this fear of what, and I do a whole thing talking about comedy and why, and stand up, and people say, "Oh, you're so brave." And I go, "What? Not brave? Like, doing stand up is not brave. That's a word we reserve for firefighters who run into a burning building or something like that, or for soldiers who run out in the middle of a street in Baghdad and pull their buddy out. That's brave. I go up and tell jokes." But the idea that people use that word with it fascinated me. And it also drove me nuts that I wouldn't overcome my own fear. And that was why I did it. So it was both a love of comedy, but also a look in the mirror going, what you are running away from or avoiding. And we just talked about this a second ago. Fear manifests itself in a variety of ways. I was so fearful of bombing or underperforming, or I don't know what. I don't know what I was scared of. I guess bombing, not getting a joke, not getting a laugh. That for 20 years I didn't go do stand-up. And finally one day I was like, "What are you doing, man? Like you teach leadership, you studied it, and yet, or I'm sorry, you teach leadership dealing with overcoming stress and dealing with your own fears, but yet you are." You're kind of a hypocrite because you will not go on stage to do stand-up because you are fearful of, and I couldn't even finish that sentence. I am fearful of insert fear, and I couldn't articulate it. And so I went and I called a good buddy of mine, my buddy Josh, and I was like, and he and I still laugh and tell the story today. He's still he's my comedy buddy. And I called him one day. I was like, "Do you want to go do stand-up?" And in true friendship, because he's one of my best buddies and in true best buddy form, he was no other context. He just goes, "Yeah, okay." Like, he didn't say where, when, what are we doing? Can you give me some more context? He was just like, "Yeah, sure. Okay." And he and I went and took a comedy class, and the rest is history.
That's so cool, John. And I appreciate you coming on today and just sharing your journey, your experiences. Honestly, I could talk to you another couple hours here and just ask you even more things around, what the SEALs do well that we can learn from. So we either got to get you back on or another Navy SEAL. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or at least me and you go grab a drink in Westchester, PA there at some point. So, yeah. All right, that's it for today's conversation. Jon has just been a great guest. He also has been a phenomenal speaker. After our interview, I really enjoyed the conversation so much that I connected him with the USA women's field hockey team just before they headed to the Paris Olympics. And he spoke to the team, and it was hugely impactful. Actually, he spoke to the leadership team, the captains first, and they loved it so much. They said, hey, we got to come back to speak to the whole team. And just really powerful messages, very inspiring, but also really gets into the practical. So be sure to check out Jon Cleck. If you're interested, you can reach out to him at jonathancleck.com. We'll put some links there in the details of this episode. Thanks again for listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you don't already, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, as well as share these episodes if you find them valuable, and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts.